Alrighty, friends. I got another guest with us today, and I'm super excited to talk and have some good conversation today with Andy, who is joining us. And Andy is he has a Instagram feed, and it is Jedi Library, right? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And he does some philosophy stuff on there with quotes and all that stuff. So, and we'll get into that later. But how are you, Andy?
I'm very well, thank you, Isaac, and thanks for inviting me on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. One of the things I love about being able to do podcasting and specifically Star Wars is interviewing people and like why people love Star Wars, why does it intrigue you, and all that stuff. And so it's just fun to talk to others that enjoy Star Wars. So that way, this way our listeners can kind of get to know like who you are and that sort of thing. Like, what got you into Star Wars, and what is like that? There's one or two things that you're like, man, I really love this about Star Wars.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of betray my age a little bit here, but when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was quite ill as a child, and it was kind of undiagnosed. No one knew what it was. But anyway, the doctors kind of signed me off school and said, you can't go to school for a few months. My parents had just bought a VHS player. So this is what's dating me here.
Yeah.
And I don't know, about a month after that, my dad brought home this big old cassette box that the VHS cassettes used to come in.
Yeah.
And it said Star Wars on the front. I think it also had a sticker saying X rental copy. So it kind of tells you where he got it from. He got it from a video cassette rental shop.
Yeah.
But he bought it and he said, look, I think you'll like this. Anyway, the next day I'm like wiped out from what I'm ill with. And I'm on my folk sofa. I put the cassette in the machine and off I go. And basically that first watch, and I'm completely intoxicated. And it's no exaggeration to say that over the next 6 months or so, aged 7, I think, I probably watched that movie, I mean, at least once a day, quite often twice a day, because it was the only movie we had. And so that, I think, just sort of infiltrated into me at that very impressionable young age.
Yeah.
Then just the way the movies came out, I then saw Return of the Jedi in the cinema.
Okay.
And then kind of a year or two later, Empire came out on the telly, which I recorded on the aforementioned VHS recorder.
Yeah.
And then, of course, for the longest time, it was just those 3 movies.
Yeah.
So got to know those very, very well as a kid. And then some of the books started coming out. Heir of the Empire series in the early 90s. And we heard rumors that Lucas wanted to do either prequels or follow-on movies, and that there might be 9, but this was all kind of hearsay. But my love for the franchise was those original first 3 movies.
Yeah.
And I guess what's slightly weird and what I've continued is that even having watched those movies at a young age, it wasn't Luke Skywalker or Obi-Wan or Darth Vader or Leia, or I wasn't like into the characters very much. It was this notion of the Force that completely intoxicates me. And I'm like, okay, even at that age, I realized that lightsabers probably don't exist, that like faster than light travel, probably not possible. But what is this thing that they're referring to called the Force? What is that? Yeah. Does it bear any resemblance to this sort of early notions of God or religion that you have as a kid? And so it just started from that little seed and has kind of grown from there. So 40 years later now, believe it or not, that has kind of been my side project, irrespective of what I've been doing in school or with work. That has always been going on in the background. And it kind of got to the point 8 years ago now that I joined up to a website called Temple of the Jedi Order. I don't know if any of your viewers or listeners will have heard of that, but it's an online kind of society.
Okay.
And I've been involved with that, not in the middle of it, somewhat to the side of it.
Yeah.
But you know, going through what they do there, I've met lots of people there, and that's all been fun. And then basically 2 years ago, I thought actually there might be a broader audience of people who don't necessarily want to join what looks like an institution, because a lot of people have problems with institutions, but they might just want to get some content which is relating to philosophy, some of the spiritual side, even a religious angle, to do with the Star Wars universe. What is the Force? What could a Jedi be in our world here on Earth in the 21st century?
Yeah. That's a very intriguing question, and and I think we especially as a kid, everyone thinks about hey, what would it be like if the Jedi was here, and how would we, and and then you can go into everything that would go into that with philosophy and the things behind it, and I think it's just so interesting. So yeah, definitely, that's awesome. I love how you just were it just captivated you as. Have you, and I know you mentioned kind of the prequels, and I mean, I know you get into the sequels and the TV series, have you kept up with all that? And what do you think? Do you like it? Is there some stuff you like, some stuff you don't like?
So I found the Phantom Menace tricky because I guess I was 23, 24 years old.
Okay.
And it was still kind of a kid's movie, so I enjoyed it. But I was definitely of that generation who somehow wanted to rekindle their youth when that just wasn't possible. A movie really cannot do that. And I think, the press it got at the time was way too harsh. It's a fine movie. And I now have friends in the community that was their equivalent of A New Hope for me. And they love it as much as A New Hope as I love A New Hope. And I totally respect that. So I enjoyed the prequels. And then the sequels obviously have come out more recently. And I was fine with The Force Awakens. From my perspective, I thought The Last Jedi got a huge amount correct, which I totally respect. Maybe a contentious opinion.
Yeah.
And then Last Skywalker, there were some things that I found tricky, but again, there was plenty they got right as well. So yeah, definitely all the movies. I love Rogue One. I love Solo. So those additional ones. And then I was slow with the Clone Wars. So I actually watched Rebels first and then thought, okay, I'm really going to understand what's going on here. I need to watch the Clone Wars. So I then did that. And then what have we had since then? Mando, Obi, and Ahsoka. And in fact, my dog, who isn't in the room at the moment, she's 10, nearly 11 years old now, and she's called Ahsoka. So I was a huge Ahsoka fan, 4, 10 or 11 years ago. So that was a long answer to what's quite a short answer could have been. I've consumed all of it. I'm still a fan, but I also look at it with this eye of thinking, okay, I thought that explanation for this part of it was awesome. I then think, well, that one, I wish I could talk to the writers sometimes to give them a little extra spin, but that's just me wanting to stick my nose in. I think they've generally done a pretty good job.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. I'm a prequels era kid, so I get that's what I grew up with. So for me, and I think for me it's those are good movies, but they are all, for me it's more of a nostalgia thing, and so I enjoy that, especially out of the nostalgia and that sort of thing. And I would agree with you. I think The Last Jedi, I think the more I've watched it, and more I've watched the sequels, the more I have enjoyed them and felt less maybe betrayed by what Disney has done, and kind of understood that. So yeah, I get you there. I think I said I feel like the more I've watched them, the more I kind of okay, I see what they're doing, or what, at least even what they were trying to do, if I'm not completely on board with it. And so yeah, definitely. So let's transition kind of our conversation. What I kind of want to talk about for the bulk of our time is and this is what you do a lot of times on your Instagram, Jedi Library. At least you print out quotes and different things and talk about philosophy with Star Wars. So what's that look like for you? Just dive into kind of the philosophy side. and how your brain works through that,
Yeah, no,
and what that
absolutely.
looks like.
Yeah, so I'd say the platform I probably put most stuff out is on YouTube, and I'm trying to
Okay,
build up
YouTube.
the Instagram to
Yeah,
kind of fill in some of the gaps there.
awesome. Yeah.
So what I did, I mean, must be late 90s, possibly 97, 98, in the
Yeah.
early days of forums on the internet. There were people talking about Star Wars and philosophy.
Yeah.
And I saw this thing saying that George Lucas had based his ideas on the Force, the light and the dark, and so on, from Taoism. So I'm like, I've never heard of Taoism
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
What's this? But in the early days of the internet, even then, you could still look this stuff up. And I very quickly saw that Taoism was linked to an ancient wisdom text called the Tao Te Ching. So I'm like, okay, if this is what inspired the thing that I'm most interested in Star Wars about, I should probably investigate that.
Yeah.
So I printed it off and read it, and I was just completely blown away. I was like, how can this have been written 2,500 years ago in China? It has so much relevance. It has so much wisdom in it. And it connected with me in a way that I had not felt connected to a philosophy or a religion in any sense before. So that set me really off down this path. It gave me something tangible to answer that question I had as a 7 or 8 year old. Is there any relevance to this in real life, in inverted commas? So I researched a huge amount of Taoism on the back of that. And we can go into some of the things there, but they're very relevant to Luke's career arc, particularly in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. There are some things which are not Taoist about him at all, but there are a lot of things which really are. So they kind of continued that a little bit. But through Taoism, I then came across the work of Alan Watts. And Alan Watts is now all over YouTube if your algorithm is tuned.
Yeah.
And he was a British guy, went to California in the 1950s, had been a Church of England minister, but then began to study particularly the Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist texts. So those sort of East Asian religions primarily, and was giving talks around California and the States through the 1960s and early 70s. And that fortunately they recorded a lot of his talks. Now, in that, he refers frequently to this notion of the perennial philosophy. And the perennial philosophy is this idea that irrespective of where people are in the world or when they have lived, you can have an overwhelming kind of enlightenment experience. And it's not necessarily long-lived. This is not to say you are enlightened or anything like that. But they have certain features that, as I say, occur very consistently across time and culture and space. And this is a feeling of complete loss of self, loss of ego, a complete connection with absolutely everything. This kind of weird feeling that everything is kind of happening exactly as it should be, even if it can feel like sometimes everything is going down the plug hole and going bad, that there's a sort of reason for that. And there are various other factors, but that's the sort of experience of that. But people began in the 19th century, when they had enough access and translations of all these different wisdom texts, to then begin to draw out the commonalities. What is common to Christianity? What is common to Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Zen, even some of the more pagan orientated religions, all the various shaman traditions and so on. This culminated for me, and this turns out it was a huge influence on Alan Watts, in a book written by Aldous Huxley. Now, you probably know Aldous Huxley through Brave New World, which has been a very popular fictional book about the problems regarding totalitarian regimes. He also wrote a very famous book called The Doors of Perception about tripping on mescaline. But bookmarked between those very, very two different books is his book called The Perennial Philosophy. Mm. And this is obviously 50 years before the internet he wrote this. The level of scholarship and the breadth of sources he has in that book is just extraordinary. And the way he draws it all together into sort of 25 different chapters, all with different kind of headings. It's not like someone saying they're just being spiritual and kind of cherry picking the bits that they like from different religions. It's saying, okay, this is common across all of them, and we love to focus on difference, and we love to focus on the arguments between different wisdom traditions, but there is just a vast amount that is extremely consistent. And so I've begun to draw that out, been influenced by a lot of the different philosophical ideas into my own conception of what we could call the Force, but has been known by so many names, by so many different people through history, but they are still referring to the same thing.
Yeah.
The absolute, the set of all sets, the ground of being. People have come up with so many different names. And I think it's completely justified for Star Wars fans or anyone who's been heavily influenced by that work to say, this is exactly what they were getting at with the Force.
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking there, I just think of like, because I think Star Wars for so many people is, it's very captivating. There's something that about Star Wars that kind of pulls at your heart, that pulls at a lot of good storytelling arcs and things. But I think also with the Force, like we are, I mean, in my beliefs and as a Christian, but also I know a lot of other people, it's whatever religion, or even if you're not necessarily religious to a specific religion, it is like we have to have this spirit. We're spiritual beings, and like
Correct.
that, it really pulls at who we are. And so I think that's like one thing about Star Wars that I just have found really interesting, and it's been cool to see like different people that have that pull and feeling that. And like as you were talking about that, it's like how even George Lucas, as he was creating this, had this in the back of his mind. It's just interesting to see even the background to maybe where the Force came from in George's mind, as we get this thing on the screen as movies and things. And then that's why I at least for me, what part of the reason it hits home so much, and the reason I love Star Wars is because of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, as is pretty well documented, he was a student of Joseph Campbell. So the hero's journey narrative is, there's no better exponent than Star Wars for the sort of archetypal example of what the hero's journey involves. And then when you actually read Joseph Campbell, it kind of makes even more and more sense. You know, his view that this meta myth, this hero's journey of an arc of kind of narrative that leads to some sort of realization, some sort of going to a different place, learning something new, facing challenges, turning down the call to adventure, all these different segments. We can apply those to our lives, even if it's just something as simple as, I don't know, getting up half an hour earlier in the morning, or changing our diet to something a bit more healthy. It can be something as relatively small as that, or it can also map onto the whole trajectory of our lives as well. But what Joseph Campbell ultimately says is that myth is kind of represented. Yes, they are engaging stories and they have meaning to us because they do represent what our lives can be like. But ultimately, myth and the characters of myth are kind of misread as stories. They talk to fundamental psychological truths in human beings, which don't seem to change over time, or with culture, or with anything else. These seem to be very intrinsic to what it means to be a human being, which is why I think the Star Wars movies speak to us so well. Yes, they're well made and they're engaging stories and they look great and the music's fantastic. But fundamentally, it's those things that really draw us in. and where we can genuinely learn something directly from the movies, or as I've done, use it as a springboard to then go and investigate the influences.
Yeah.
And I mean, my goodness, I feel so privileged to live in 2024 when literally on my phone in my pocket, I have access to all the wisdom that has ever been put down on paper.
Yeah.
Now, how you pass that out, how you make sense of that, maybe becomes increasingly difficult. It can be almost like information overload.
Yeah.
But to have that there and have access to that and to be able to work with that, I find that a huge privilege that sometimes we too easily overlook.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can definitely take those things for granted. The resources and things we have access to. And yeah, definitely. I think another thing you mentioned a little bit before too is like the fact that like you mentioned like this wisdom literature, this text that goes into Taoism and these other areas that had this influence on what Star Wars ended up being, and the Force specifically, but is and kind of going back to us as like humans and why we relate to that and all that is the fact that like these texts are thousands of years old, and I mean some of them vary and how old they are exactly, but we like these were concepts and ideas that humans were talking about and thinking about in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and ancient Egyptian times and even back before that. Like, and so it's just I find that it's just interesting that those types of concepts ended up in a hey, like this isn't new. Like these ideas aren't new, but it's put in a new format in the 20th century and 21st century that we are intaking. And so I just find that so very, very intriguing, and kind of gives me even more of a respect for what George did with Star Wars and where he pulled everything from, knowing that there's a lot of history behind what he was going for, and I find that super intriguing as you were talking about that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I guess Star Wars could have happened anywhere at any time, but to be in Northern California, grow up in that area in the late 60s and early 70s as George did, he was in the right place. That was like the cutting edge of where this comparative kind of spirituality was coalescing. So it's kind of no coincidence that it came out there and then, but it must have taken a massive leap. No one had ever tried to introduce anything like this into anything else. It was kind of mad when you think about the context at the time. But yeah, I for one, literally any interest I have in philosophy, psychology, comparative religion and so on is purely because of Star Wars. So I owe it a huge debt of gratitude for that. I think also it does another thing that's extremely important, and that's to say that you can read all the books in the world. You can have the most insightful understanding of the wisdom that's in these books. You can even meditate 12 hours a day. But if it's not having a visceral impact on your personality, on your life, on your ethics, then it's kind of, there's no point. There has to be a follow through into the way it affects your real life. And I think the whole concept of having Jedi in Star Wars, who for sure are fallible and have human qualities of fallibility, do try and put what they learn and put what they know and put what they feel. There's a lot of reflection on feelings. Like, don't entirely trust your senses. They're helpful, but actually you've got to have all these inputs of information, be it emotion, be it knowledge, be it research, be it your senses and so on. And to kind of get out of the way of yourself. The whole point of feeling the Force, I think, has got very close correlations with the relatively new science of flow research. There's a lot of research in the psychology literature now about how and why people enter into flow states. So for anyone that isn't aware, a flow state is something you will have experienced without even necessarily knowing it or knowing what it was called. You know, if you're playing sport or playing music, even reading a book, even watching a movie, doing any activity where your skill set is just being stretched to the challenge that is being set you, you get the similar kind of experiences again. So all your problems evaporate. You don't have time to think about your problems. You don't even really think of yourself as a self. It also can feel like you're not really doing it yourself. It is happening. There is a happening of which what was you is involved.
Yeah.
And you speak to any sports person after they've just done some tremendous thing, and they'll be like, okay, that was great. I don't quite know what happened.
Yeah. It's like a almost instinctual, like what we go into this mode of, we rely on instincts, and what we know, and what, like, kind of that that sort of thing. Is that what you're kind of getting at with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely a line in one of the movies where I think Obi-Wan tells Luke to act on instinct.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's exactly right. What I'd just clarify is that instinct is obviously innate.
Yeah.
But it is something that can be trained. So it's not just something you're born with. And I'd say exactly the same thing for what we might call conscience. Like, everyone has one to a greater or lesser extent, but the conscience can also be trained. So there's a physical aspect, there's an emotional aspect, there's a mental aspect. And I'm not a dualist, so all of those are aspects of one fundamental similar thing. But yeah, training and discipline and all of those things, it's no joke. If you want to have agency in the world in a way that you want to be agentic, then all of those parts of the puzzle have to be in place. And the good news is, as you were saying, some of these wisdom texts are thousands of years old, but I still have quite a scientific kind of 21st century hat on as well. And so much of the science now is beginning to come into line, whether that's like the impact of meditation, whether it is encouraging ways in which to fall into flow states. So it doesn't just have to be when you're nailing a guitar piece that you hit a great tennis shot or whatever it is. You can literally trigger yourself to fall into those states just slicing a tomato or sitting in a traffic jam. So that's almost where the real skill is with that. I'd say also, just without wanting to get too technical on the philosophy side, a lot of the metaphysics, and a lot of people kind of confuse mysticism with metaphysics. Metaphysics isn't something mystical. Metaphysics is basically the discussion in philosophy about what is most fundamental. You know, we've lived in a physicalist or materialist paradigm now for 200, 300 years, and with very good reason. When Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, it's because he was saying things that the church didn't like. So the fledgling scientific community said collectively, right, church, you can keep soul and spirit and mind. We're just going to deal with this physical stuff and try and work out what's going on there. And, you know, we made tremendous progress over 200, 300 years doing that. But it doesn't mean to say that's metaphysically true. It doesn't mean to say the world is made of matter. It's a bit like saying trees are made of wood. It's kind of nonsensical. And for those viewers of yours who are keen to sort of delve into that side of things more deeply, there are two guys who I would really strongly recommend doing some research on, and they're all over YouTube and podcasting and so on. One of whom is Professor Douglas Hoffman, who's a cognitive neuroscientist who's written a great book called The Case Against Reality. And the other would be Bernardo Kastrup, who is a Dutch researcher, super bright. And he's developed a philosophy called analytic idealism. So this is basically saying that they come from different angles, but the bottom line is this world of matter that we spend so much time kind of worrying about and getting bogged down is less fundamental than what has been known in the past as soul or spirit, and what scientists would now call consciousness.
Yeah.
So even the hard-nosed scientific side of things is kind of coming in the direction of what we might call the force being fundamental. And it's not necessarily the same as God or as consciousness, but everyone's tried to point at the moon here.
Yeah.
And everyone's stared at the fingers pointing at the moon. And we're now in a wonderful position to step back and say, okay, we can see the fingers pointing at the moon. Let's actually have a look at the moon now and see what that is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that is interesting because it's this, it's I think of it as a holistic approach to who we are as humans, as we're not just physical, we are, we're spiritual, we're emotional, we're, and other things you can throw in there as well. But we're starting to have this in our modern world. We're starting to have more of a holistic approach to who we are, and I think as we talk about Star Wars, I think Star Wars helps us to have more of this focus more on the soul or the spiritual or the emotional side of things, and have a holistic approach. And I wonder too if that, and that was interesting. You mentioned like really the past 200-300 years, we were really in this, unless you were in a religious, in some sort of religion or in church or whatever that is, like you were very focused. And even for those who were religious, there's definitely a focus on the physical. And so I wonder if Star Wars came along in a time where, hey, like we were so focused on the spirit or on the physical that like this spiritual, emotional side of things really intrigued people with the Force. And so that's a very interesting, like Star Wars came into a society and a culture and when in a time when people were focused on the physical, and so then it intrigued people in a way that they may have not have thought about before or in a different aspect.
Well, certainly for my generation and your generation, I think that's definitely true. It's kind of not coincidental that the 1980s are known as possibly being the most materialistic decade in Western society for the whole of history. So those things are coincidental. But interestingly, it's actually one of the fundamental Taoist ideas is that when you hit one extreme at one end of the spectrum, that contains the seed of its opposite. Everything is fluctuating, shrinking or growing, and I think it would be tough to argue that that's solely down to Star Wars or whatever, but I think Star Wars was definitely symptomatic of a necessity for a switch back away from that really quite hardcore pure materialism.
And it is a piece of that in the bigger picture, and especially when it comes to entertainment and that side of things, of looking at it from like an entertainment perspective, as also with the psychology and science and all that behind it, of the material to more of a spiritual side of that. Definitely, that's awesome. I loved like this conversation. You're getting my mind going and thinking some, and I've enjoyed this so much. So kind of transition a little bit in more directly the religious route. And like I said, you can share as much as you want. Like personally for you, when you think of Star Wars, you think of religion, and where you're at with religion. Like what is that connection for you? Is there a connection? And I know all this goes into the philosophy behind it, like we've been talking about. What does that religion piece look like for you?
Yeah, I've always had a slightly challenged relationship with the notion of religion, not with religion itself, but the notion of it.
Yeah.
So first of all, I firmly believe that it's possible for each individual person to have a direct, unmediated connection to whatever the absolute is that people might call God, I might call the Force, someone else might call Brahman, someone else would call Buddha nature. We're all talking about the same fundamental thing. And unfortunately, in institutionalized religion, often just through power dynamics, it wasn't a theologian who came up with this idea of inserting layers of priesthood or money you have to pay even. I mean, it's so crazy. It's like God isn't poor. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't need your money. It's the church does, perhaps, or the temple does. So I've always had a slightly strained relationship with that side of it. But for all the mystical traditions, be they the Catholic mystics and the old Christian mystics, the Gnostics, the Sufis of Islam. So in the sort of Middle Eastern / Western, well, the Abrahamic faith, it's the same with Judaism as well. What's interesting is that the knowledge that you can have a direct communion with the totality became esoteric in the Abrahamic faiths. Whereas in the East, whether that was Taoism, Hinduism, or Buddhism, which Alan Watts, to refer to him again, described as Hinduism for export, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it, that knowledge became exoteric. It was just what people accepted. To the extent that in India, when you say hello to someone, you say namaste, and namaste literally means I see the Godhead in you. That's just like day-to-day hi. So basically, I'm very open to all religious interpretation, irrespective of denomination or who it was that had the initial revelation, whether it was Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad or whoever it was. They were all having a fundamentally very similar and groundbreaking, earth-shattering experience, which then people turned into slightly different directions, but so much similarity. So yeah, that's where I stand with it. My personal sort of favorites remain Taoism. I'm still very keen on that, but perhaps more from the Western tradition, I think the Quakers are phenomenal. And they have an unbelievable track record about anti-slavery, about equality between the sexes. They have no priesthood. There's no clergy, and their ceremonies are effectively silent. There's a bit at the end of meeting where people can feel, well, literally they call it their inner light. They become almost sort of forced to speak, or not forced to speak, but they feel a necessity to speak, or that something's going to speak through them. That's not far off for me. There are wonderful things you can kind of be influenced by and encouraged by, I think, in almost all religions. Whether I've got a soft spot for Zen. I mentioned the Sufis of Islam, who are I mean, you read Rumi and it's just mind blowing, or Kabir, those Islamic saints. The insight and the burning love that you feel coming through in their writing. I won't get too sort of political or anything, but it's such a shame that Islam in the last 100 years or so has been presented to us who are not Muslims in the sort of Wahhabist interpretation, which is super recent. And I hope and pray that dwindles and we can get a kind of increased Sufi influence on the Islam world. I think that would be great.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And I think, like, as you talk about all those, that's like you can definitely see that connection back to Star Wars and how we do that. And definitely the Quakers. Like, I have friends who are Quakers, so I definitely connect with that. And I think like one thing and kind of a theme I picked up as we've kind of talked today, and I think I just want to highlight is, and you've mentioned, is the fact that like there's so many similarities within different religions, within different philosophical thought, and I think for me, as I'm a Christian, I'm in the currently in the Nazarene denomination, and am very committed there, and a part of that, and even a part of leadership in that church. But for me, I think sometimes I love conversations like this because there's so much more we have in common than we have different.
Absolutely.
And we make such a divide between religions or political things or whatever that is for your context where you're at. And there's so many similarities and things we can talk about, we can discuss, and we can understand. And I think it goes back to the fact that we're all humans. We all have emotions. We all understand maybe some sort of a spiritual pull, regardless of how that manifests for each of us. And I think just that sense, and I have my personal beliefs and I have those beliefs, but I can also respect those of others and see how similarities, and we have conversations, and we can have may I say polite debates on who's right, who's wrong, or if all of us are right or all of us are wrong. And so it's
funny, I was going to say something similar. I think it's actually both. I firmly believe that, particularly in all of what used to be called, this sounds wrong to say it now, all the higher religions, they're all on, give or take, the right track. Whether they've been deviated from that track by personalities or culture is another matter entirely. But if you go back to the foundational teachings, there is such a similarity there. And it's very clear that you can reach communion with the absolute, or the force, as I would call it, by any number of different routes. That it's not just like one track. You have to be open, I think, to all the different sorts.
Definitely. And I mean, for me and my personal belief, and as a Christian, and as I believe there is one way to God, and that's part of my beliefs. But at the same time, I don't want to disrespect others in the sense of like, hey, you have that belief, and you have that, and also the fact that, like we talked about, there's similarities, there's things to that, and so like I think it's the understanding we can have those personal beliefs, but still not.
Well, you're not wrong.
Exile others,
you're not wrong. You do have one way, to God, and that may well be through the personhood of Jesus Christ, and that is your way. And there's nothing wrong with you having a very, very firm faith in it, or even you could say a knowledge that is your way. So I think it's possible, from the perspective we're both coming at, to hold these things together. Like, they're not actually opposing views. The language can generate opposition. Sometimes. No, I hear you loud and clear on that, Isaac.
So and I love to be able to have conversations like this, and have conversations that are respectful, that allows everybody to think, and all that. And so I've really enjoyed this conversation today with you, Andy, and you've got me thinking about certain things, and like that maybe I want to go research more. And so as we end, I kind of want to end on this note of, like, with all this said, we've talked about a lot of things, we've used a lot of big words, and dived in a lot of different areas. I think there's a going back to this idea of spirituality in Star Wars, or philosophy in Star Wars. There's how it was created. We all have this natural pull because of how humans operate, how we the need and necessities that we have within us that Star Wars is something that I think pulls at our heartstrings, pulls at who we are as humans, and I think you've done a great job today at kind of expressing that and helping. I know me, and I think others understand like what that looks like. So thanks for coming on, and I really appreciate our conversation and chatting about this.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity, Isaac. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation as well. And, you mentioned about us being human beings, but spiritual beings. There was a French philosopher called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin who said, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience.
Yeah.
And as soon as I read that, I was like, this dude sounds just like Yoda when he says,
yeah,
luminous beings are we.
Yeah.
So we should all remember, luminous beings are we.
Yep, not the crude matter, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way, I think, to end our conversation today. So thanks for coming on. This was super awesome. We'll make sure for you guys listening, I'll get all of Andy's stuff in the description, YouTube and Instagram and all that, and you go check him out. But yeah, thanks for coming on. This has been a great conversation.
No, I appreciate that, Isaac. And if you ever want to do it again, just give me a shout.
We might do that. So for you guys listening, we might bring Andy back on because I think we talked for about 45 minutes. I'm pretty sure I was sitting here thinking, I'm like, man, I could talk for another couple hours. I think.
Oh yeah, we've just scratched this. We've just scratched
into all this. So, that's super awesome.
It's the right way to start.
So. Yep, definitely awesome. Thank you, sir, and I hope you have a great day and a great weekend.
You too. Thanks.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.